Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. As you know, or as you may not know, LEDA, Lakeshore Ethnic Diversity Alliance, has been having these weekly community conversations since the beginning of June after George Floyd's death. We determined that we needed to do more than just sign a pledge, but rather to focus on how can we help different people be heard, different voices be heard, and help build bridges between different parts of our community. So as a result, we started these community conversations focusing on having the voices of people of color or BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people you ordinarily might not see or hear, but who are doing amazing things in their own right. And before I introduce our guest, I just wanted you to pay attention to make sure you vote or have voted already. I have voted already. I have my I voted sticker or pin. So I will take that off so that we do not keep distracting each other. So I'm very pleased to bring Michelle Jokisch Polo on. Some of you may know her formerly with WGVU, and she has helped LEDA out most recently at our summit on race and inclusion. And so, Michelle, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Yes, thanks for having me here today, Gloria. I appreciate the opportunity. So I am currently the Latinx reporter and the weekend edition host at WKAR. WKAR is the NPR affiliate in Lansing, part of Michigan State University. And how I got here is I came to the United States when I was 18 years old. I went to a small private college in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and I built community here. And that was over 10 years ago, and here we are today. And at the time, I really wanted to go into journalism, but as an English language learner, Spanish is my first language, I felt that I didn't have the capacity or the knowledge to do that work. But I had the privilege to get started as a journalist at El Vocero Hispano, which is the largest Hispanic newspaper in Michigan. And that's where, I got my first in this space. And I don't know if you remember this, Gloria, but you and I met back then. I interviewed you for a story about the Girl Scouts. I went into your office and we talked about the work that you'd been doing with the Girl Scouts, and I remember that moment because it was the first time that I had met a Latina woman in power, in a high power position. And I just remember thinking at the time, like, oh, like we exist and we're out there. And I don't know why that moment just like struck out to me, but it was, I think it was pivotal for me because I was like, oh, there, she is older than me. She's done the work, and look where she's at.
Wow.
So
well,
yeah.
Thank you, because you're talking about it's El Vocero, right?
Yes.
Right. Mm-hmm. And you're talking about this as, wait a second. Someone interviewed me. I think it was Michelle. So that was such a long time ago because we both came to Grand Rapids at about the same time, or you started working about the same time that I came to Grand Rapids, which was in 2010, to head up the Girl Scouts. And, one of the things, and I probably need to have someone from El Vocero on, but one of the things that I found out that was very interesting is a lot of ethnic communities really relate through their ethnic newspapers. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you learned when you were working at El Vocero about that whole immediate contact?
Yeah, I would say that for Grand Rapids and El Vocero serves as a big connection to resources news in people's language. And there are no other news sources, at least in Grand Rapids. I mean, well, I guess at the time there weren't other news sources. Now that we have a radio station, we have, other magazines and so on. But at the time, there were very few consistent sources of news that were not just about national news, the news that you can see on Telemundo or Univision, but it was local news. And it was local news that also shared with readers of supports and services that they could benefit from or get connected to, as well as stories from their neighbors, their community. And I think the community here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, really relies on El Vocero for news, unbiased news coverage that is consistent.
Right, because I'm always picking it up whenever I go to some of my favorite Mexican restaurants or to the supermercados, because they're everywhere. And, I practice trying to read my Spanish as I'm looking at the English version of that. But I am amazed by the breadth of the communities. And I know, for example, the Asia Pacific community has their own, and different ethnic communities have their own media that aren't mainstream. But like you said, the communities really, really rely on that for news and information. Since we're on the topic of journalism and El Vocero, can you just share with us maybe a story or two that you found really impactful or interesting that you still remember all these years later?
Yes. So while I was at El Vocero, I had the opportunity to do a series on driver's license. And at the time, that was in 2013. And so at that time, Michiganders, undocumented immigrants from Michigan, had just lost the right to get a driver's license in Michigan. Terry Linland was a Secretary of State at the time, and she advocated for the passage of a bill that would that in order for you to get a driver's license, you had to either have some sort of permanent residence or like a student visa. But if you're undocumented, you couldn't get one anymore. And so at the time, I didn't really know much of what was happening legislatively, but I started doing this series about driver's license and laid out the history and laid out what we needed to do, what the community needed to do to get to change legislation. It's been over 7 years, and we still don't have the change in legislation. But I think people are aware of what they need to do to make that change happen. There's bills that are introduced at both the House and the Senate. And I think like local activists and grassroots organizers have been advocating for that change. But for me, it was just, looking back to that story and that series, it was pivotal because it showed me that there's a problem, there's history. Let's talk about the history and the racism that got us here. And let's talk about how do we inform the community of what they can do moving forward. And that was so powerful. I think that's the power that journalism has.
I mean, you took the words out of my mouth, because that's why journalism is important. And that's why, it's so important to have an independent journalism. You may not always like, if you're the subject of a story, you may not always like what's being said, but your hope is that it can be objective and that they're, looking at all sides of the story so that people can make up their minds of that. I mean, but, let's go back to the very, very beginning. What made you think of journalism? Because I find it fascinating. First of all, what country did you come here from, so people have an idea of that impact?
Yeah, so I came from Ecuador, from Quito, Ecuador, and it's a country in South America. But I was born in El Salvador, in San Salvador, which is another country in Central America. And my father is from El Salvador and my mother is from Ecuador. So when there was a civil war in El Salvador, that created a lot of tension for different communities there and a lot of violence. And so eventually my family decided to move to Ecuador. And I spent, I would say, most of my teenage years in Ecuador before coming to the United States. And when I first came to the United States, I thought I was going to major in psychology. And I did major in psychology. You know, I thought I was going to go to grad school and become a therapist. But after graduating, I just had this thirst to get to know individuals and the opportunity to share those stories. And somehow I ended up finding that journalism fit that thirst well, and that I had the power to do something about those stories that I was hearing. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does, because everyone sort of, once you find what really gets you excited and really focused on, it doesn't seem like, quote, a job, but something that you can keep doing, and because it's always fascinating to you, and what you say, you find fascinating to get to know different people as well and their stories, which is.
Yeah, and I think journalism is really about relationship building. Wouldn't you say? I mean, you're more likely to want to be interviewed by a reporter you already have a relationship with, by a reporter that's not going to take you at face value, but it's going to say, let's talk about where you come from. Let's talk about why you think this way or why you made that decision. And that's the kind of journalism that I really want to I really want to do, that I really want to create, the journalism that puts people first above, other things, other institutions or other things.
Great. I mean, it's so important to all of us, to really focus on what is really happening, and what do these people stand for, and can you trust them? And I think journalism has a huge role in that. But right now, you are now focusing on Latinx stories from across the state of Michigan, which because of your facility with both English and Spanish, I think it's fascinating. And the Latinx population in Michigan has just gotten so much bigger than people realized. What have you learned since you came here that really made you realize that it was something that other people needed to pay attention to?
I think that, let's talk about elections, right? In Michigan, we're a swing state, and Latinx Michiganders have the power to change how the state swings, whether it swings red or it swings blue. And so that tells you the power that this community has. And I think when we don't realize that there are so many Latinx folks in our communities that have different experiences than, say the Dutch community or the Polish community, but that have different experiences, not just in, culturally, but in how they came to Michigan. I think that, and I think that a lot of folks aren't telling those stories. They haven't prioritized those communities. And that's why it's so important to see their power, to value their power, because in fact, like, they do have the power to change the state from one color to the other, politically speaking.
And that's one of the reasons for me doing these series, is that we do realize that we are able to have an influence, but until you determine how to exercise that influence, you're basically left out, what I would call left out in the weeds, and not really having input into that. You were talking about driver's licenses, and I believe the state of California you're able to get a driver's license regardless of your documentation status.
Yeah, and the state of Illinois is another one. DC, you can as well. I believe Maryland too, New York. There's so many states where you can. And so that's why it's interesting that Michigan you used to be able to. And now we've sort of switched things around. And I wonder if that's, people who got voted in, right? And it's important for us, for those of us who can vote, to think, okay, who do I want in power? What are the things that would benefit me and the rest of my community?
Right. But then, when you think about what a driver's license makes possible, I mean, just being able to take your children to school. Well, actually, nowadays, not necessarily taking your children to school, but, just those everyday things that we do without any thought of just hopping in the car and doing that. That's something that I think, treat people with respect, because they do so many people do so many things that make our everyday lives possible. And I think we're starting to realize that during the pandemic of really who are the essential workers. It's not just the physicians and the nurses and the healthcare workers, but it's the people that are delivering the packages to your home, the people that are staying, in the stores and working. I mean, so
It's your domestic workers. It's the people who are picking our food during the pandemic, packaging our food during the pandemic. It's our construction workers. There's a lot of invisible essential workers, Latinx essential workers that haven't been prioritized, especially during the pandemic.
right. So that's something that people to reflect on. Let's switch to some of the stories that you've started doing. Can you share some of them with us?
Yeah, so one of the first stories that I did at WKAR was about migrant student or kids of migrant workers who were coming to MSU back to college during the pandemic. Back in the fall when everything was schools were starting to figure out whether they were going to reopen or not. And so my story focused on these students and how they dealt with their university closing amidst a pandemic when their parents had already prepared. They had bought their what do they call it, the things that you need for the dorm. They had made sure that they had a ride to the university, some of them coming from places like Texas or Florida. And then, one student that I spoke with halfway to Michigan, she found out that the dorms were closed and that she wouldn't be able to live in the dorms. And she didn't feel like she could tell her family because they had just spent all this money to get her there. And, it became a bigger deal. And, she figured it out. She was able to connect to resources in our campus community. But I think the point of it is like, when we make decisions like this, sometimes the most marginalized are left fend for themselves. And in this case, it was a really hard choice for students who are children of migrant workers. Another story I got the opportunity. Well, I'm that's going to air this Saturday on All Things Considered nationally. Is a story about undocumented immigrants in Michigan, in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, and they were finding that, they were going to have to leave their jobs if they wanted their kids to go to school because schools are virtual in Ann Arbor. And so they had to figure out, like, am I going to make the decision to leave my job? Can I still pay my bills? And even if I do leave my job, can I support my child who is learning in English? And in this case, many of the parents don't know English or know a little bit of English. Can they still help their child go to school virtually, with their homework or with the emails they might be getting with the teacher? And I think, like, for them, they were finding like they were in a tough place. And instead of sitting in that tough place, they got together and organized themselves and created a learning pod. And today that learning pod has 24 students. The students meet at a church and they have a teacher, bilingual support staff, and the parents get to go to work and they know that their kids are going to be safe. Everyone wears a mask. COVID-19 precautions are taken. And, those families organized and created the support that they needed. And I think that's really powerful. We don't often hear those stories of marginalized communities organizing to create the solutions that they need.
I lost my mouse for a minute. So.
That's okay.
No, that's an amazing story, Michelle. So I'm interested. So go back. How did you hear about this? And what was your process to do this?
That's a good question. And it goes back to what I'm saying about relationship building. I want to be the journalist that builds relationships and prioritize relationships above all. And it's because I've been connected with organizers in Michigan, Latinx undocumented organizers who know of my work and who believe in my work. And they told me about this pod and they said, we're going to invite you in, like, come interview the families, come interview the kids, like spend a day with us and, keep us in the loop. And they felt that they could trust that I would do the story good, that I would be able to tell the story from their perspectives while, making sure that their, confidentiality is respected, because we are interviewing many undocumented families. We have to make sure, they're kept anonymous, that we only use middle names or first names. And, with journalism, I think old school journalism, it's all about your sources and making sure you name your sources and have attribution. But in this case, I think the story speaks for itself in that we had to prioritize these families and their experiences. And I feel so privileged that I got the opportunity to, spend a day with these kids and they meet at a church and they have a beautiful ground outside the church where they get to spend recess, run around. And for a mere moment, kids get to be kids. These kids who every day are reminded that, like, their parents could be taken from them because of immigration. I spoke with one girl where her mom they have created a plan together in case one day they get stopped. And not only are they dealing with that, they're also dealing with pandemic and, fear of, am I going to get COVID? Is my mom going to, as an essential worker, get COVID? But, also, are we going to have enough money to pay bills, because everyone's struggling economically? And, for a moment, I got to see them just being kids at the center. And that was so beautiful.
Well, that's an amazing story, how you got to do that. And then I think the solution, people, that's one thing that I always said is people, particularly women, particularly, BIPOC women, even Latinx women, have a lot more leadership capability and potential than they think they have. Because when someone says you're a leader, they expect the leader to be someone that's standing up in front of everyone, telling everyone how to do things and what needs to be done. But I think that solution is so amazing because it seems to work in so many ways. Because one of the things that I've been involved with is looking at broadband access, and it's even more critical now. So all of a sudden, you've got these kids at a church that probably has excellent broadband access for them.
Yeah, that was one of the challenges that they discussed, is getting internet. I don't know if people know, but to get internet, some companies require you to have a social security number or a credit card. And if you don't have those things, you can't get internet. Thankfully, schools have stepped up and are able to provide hotspots, or libraries have stepped up and are able to provide hotspots, but not everyone lives in a community that does that. And I think that when you talk about school, how can you do school without internet or a computer?
Right. I mean, I was reading a story about a young child who was walked across, they lived behind a school, and he was just basically hanging up in the school during the school day so he could get the Wi-Fi. And that's something that, a lot of people don't realize that, oh, well, just send them home and go do, your homework and do your schoolwork and join your classroom via Zoom or whatever the different instructors use. But it is not as easy as we may think it is. Um, that's. Do you have another example of something that you found very inspiring?
Of another story?
Yes.
Yeah, so another story that I was able to do recently is the power of the Latinx vote. And that's why I brought it up earlier. I went to Lansing to interview many Latinx folks in Lansing and to see how they vote or how they would vote. And time again, I heard that the Latinx electorate in mid-Michigan, or even I would say like maybe the whole state, it hasn't been engaged by either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party in the way that it could be. And political analysts from here, I interviewed a few at the University of Michigan, they kept saying, yeah, the Latinx electorate has so much power, but they're not engaged to the level that they could be. And the problem is that everyone assumes Latinx people are the same, right? So Latinx in Florida are the same as Latinx in Michigan. And that's actually like very wrong. The Latinx folks in Michigan are not as recent immigrants as the Latinx in Florida or maybe even the Latinx folks in Texas are. And so the ones in Michigan have been here longer compared to the ones in Florida. And so that I guess like shapes how they vote. So for example, you're gonna see in Florida more Latinx folks from Cuba and Venezuela. While here we see more Latinx folks from Mexico who have been in the United States for longer, who might not be as concerned with like government meddling with what they believe is their personal interests. So they will vote differently. So parties need to know that they can't engage Latinx folks in Michigan the same way that they engage Latinx folks in Florida.
And that's something that I keep saying. It's like we're all very different just based on when our families got here, where they're from. I mean, my personal family, my father's family is from the mountains of Michoacan, and they were farmers. My mother's family is from Sinaloa, another state, but they were very wealthy. So, in Mexico, they never would have met. But, here in the United States, they met at church, for example. And so you get all that different mix of cultures and people from within the same country, even. So that's within the same country, but then you have, all the countries south of the United States are all very different. And people need to keep realizing that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't you say that that influences how we vote?
I would say so, yes, because, I remember I know I'm supposed to be asking you questions, but since it's election time, I remember, so I'm old enough to remember John Kennedy running for office. And I remember my dad having the Kennedy button, but my mom voted for Nixon. And if you think about it, I remember I said my dad's family were farmers and they worked out in the fields. My mom's family was wealthy. So you get two different, influences as they were growing up, totally different than from each other. And that sort of colored how they viewed the different, political parties, for example.
Yeah,
So,
that's so interesting. Kind of reminds me of how things are today, right? Because you
mhm.
could have two Latinx folks, one in Florida, one in Michigan, and they could vote completely different from each other.
Right. Or even the same, but for completely different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's what, the major political parties haven't really realized that, we're individuals too. We aren't monolithic.
And I think that's the goal for me with my stories is like, let's tell individual stories of Latinx people, not the whole generalization of, oh, we're all like this, oh, we all come from Mexico, we all like tacos, or we all speak Spanish. Because again, like that's another point. Not all of us speak Spanish. Some of us do, but a lot of, at least for Michigan, the largest of voters who are Latinx are not Spanish speaking.
Right. I mean, I can speak Spanish and understand it, but I can't read or write it, for example, because I didn't start speaking English until I started school.
And I think that's the story of so many Michiganders too.
Right, exactly. So people need to realize that. And let me just bring you a little bit closer to home. When you were at WGVU, you did a session on, I just lost it. The stories that you were telling about different people, and someone's going to pop in.
It was about shaping narratives?
Yes, that was Shaping Narratives.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, can you tell us a little bit about that and how that all got started?
Yeah, so Shaping Narratives was started by Mariano Avila, and he had this great idea of, Mariano is another fellow journalist in Michigan, and he had the great idea of creating a cohort of people where the cohort of people made up of all people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, so that they could learn how to tell their stories in some sort of medium. So whether it was through TV, like film, or a podcast, or let me think about I think it was just TV or radio. And they had, I believe, 5 or 6 participants. And, one person told their story about being outdoors and the lack of representation in outdoor spaces for people of color. And her name is Alice Lynn. And Alice really she interviewed Indigenous folks in Michigan about the land and land sovereignty and how we need to treat the land, and how, whether Indigenous people and people of color are welcomed into outdoor spaces, and what's it like to be a Black woman in an outdoor space. Because I don't know if you know, Gloria, these spaces are largely white. People who hike, people who, spend time camping or outdoors are very white. And that's for a number of reasons, right? Whether it's
and I saw a lot of that with Girl Scouts.
Exactly
the girls that were camping. A lot of them did it because their parents did it and their family did it. But you get girls of color, and they didn't go camping. I mean, my husband is Black, and his family went camping, but there were very few families went camping. I mean, we just recently went camping up north, and every time we go camping, there's not that many people that look like us,
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point. And we talk about why, right? Like it's access. It's access to even pay time off to be able to take your kids camping, or a car, or knowledge of like camping. You need a lot of equipment to camp, right? You need a little stove, a tent, a sleeping bag. And some of those things can be like overwhelming to figure out if you've never done it before. And so, that historically has made those spaces very white. And Alice got to tell that story. We also had another person tell the story of being a Black or an immigrant from Africa. And what's it like to be an African immigrant in the United States? Well, while their experiences is not the same as a Black American person, it's that of an African immigrant. Christine Mwangi shared that story. She used to work with you guys. And she shared, the similarities and the differences between being an African immigrant and coming into the United States and seeing how racism plays a factor for many Black Americans in the country.
Right. I mean, because we worked together for a little bit, and I remember her telling me that she had no idea what it was to be Black until she came to the United States.
Yeah, it's and she tells this in her podcast, but and it's called The Black Honest Truth if folks want to look for it. But she talks about how, back home, she had domestic workers, her family was well off, and everybody around her looked like her. And then she comes to the United States, and all of a sudden her family is maybe doesn't have as much money as they used to. They have to live in a 1-bedroom home. And then she's being treated differently for the color of her skin. But that, like she told you, that was something she didn't understand until it came here. She came here.
Right. I mean, that's what was fascinating, so I can see why you're really fascinated by people's stories, how they came here, what they think, how they interact, how they come up with solutions. I think your story that I think you said it's going to be on All Things Considered this coming Saturday.
Yes, it's going to be on All Things Considered this Saturday on any NPR station you want to listen. It's going to air nationally. And that's exciting, I think, not just for me, but it's exciting that like our community is getting heard, getting listened to. Their stories are getting out there. And, we do this so that other people can do it much easier, can have an easier time doing it.
Right. So, that must be exciting for you personally. Is this your first national story, or?
It is not. When I was at WGVU, I had the opportunity to do another national story about Grand Rapids passing an ordinance or a law that if you called 911 on a Black person or a person of color and you were being racist, you could be fined. And because there's a lot of instances of those cases here, and of course all across the country, people call if they see a Black person walking around thinking, oh yeah, there's something wrong, there must be something wrong. And so in Grand Rapids they passed an ordinance to address some of that, and I got to interview the folks who were responsible for passing it and got to do a national story on that.
No, that's great, Michelle. I mean, we can say that we knew you when you become the voice of NPR. So what advice would you give to young people, particularly Latinx, who might be thinking of telling their stories? How do they get started?
That's a really good question, because for me, it was hard. It wasn't until I'm 30 now, but it wasn't until I was 27 that I got my first full-time job, or I was 26, or 27, yes. I get my first full-time job working as a reporter, and it took a long time to get there. I didn't really have the connections here. I didn't have a degree in journalism. I didn't know what the traditional path is. But what I would say for a young Latinx person who wants to get into the field and is trying to figure out where they can be is go on, wherever you're interested in going, whether it's like NPR or, a print, a newspaper or whatever, and look at their staff and look for someone that looks like you. And then reach out to them, because that person is likely understands your experience and understands where you're coming from and can give you a foot in the door. I can tell you that if someone reaches out to me and reminds me of myself, I will make the point of connecting them to opportunities because I know what that's like. I know that it's not easy. It's not easy to be a young Latinx journalist trying to get into that space.
Okay. So I'm going to put up your email address so that's how they can contact you. But also, are there, if we have a story, if someone has a story, that's how they can contact you. But are there stories or areas that you wish you had a better insight into?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things I would really like to look more into or like give more of a platform to is migrant farm workers. I think many migrant farm workers have had a very, very difficult time with the pandemic and their voice, and not just the pandemic, right? But I'm specifically talking about right now. But I think their voices need to be heard in a responsible way. And the stories of migrant farm workers is something that I would really like to uplift in the future. And I'd appreciate any connections. And like Gloria said, my email, you can always email me pitches. I will email you back. My email is on the screen.
So great. So I will take your email off and put up another banner, which I showed you earlier, which we started with. So people to remember to vote, to make a plan. And it must be sort of very exciting for you being in Lansing. And, I need to apologize to our audience because we were supposed to have you on about 2 weeks ago, but you got called to a press conference with the governor.
Yeah, so it was 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks, yes.
It was 2 weeks ago. And that's when everything was blowing up with Whitmer and the allegations of her getting kidnapped. And I don't know if everyone knows, but at the time, Governor Gretchen Whitmer received some allegations that she was being threatened to be kidnapped by some folks in the militia here, and it was all hands on deck in my newsroom. All of us are working, from home, but when things like this pop up, we just kind of have to like drop everything and go. And that's the life of journalism. You're always following the story. Sometimes your time is not your own.
Right. And so that's why Michelle wasn't on when we were, because she was doing her job, which is letting us know what we need to know.
Yeah, I appreciate the flexibility, Gloria.
Great. Thank you. So, are there any parting thoughts that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, I would say that it's important that we advocate to tell our own stories and that we hold journalists accountable. And so I encourage everyone who's listening to not just hold me accountable, but not just hold everyone else accountable, but also hold me accountable on the work that I'm doing. If you have a question or concern, feel free to email me. And if you want to get into this field, like I welcome any questions or emails. My interest is in building those relationships and maintaining those with our community.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I really enjoyed speaking with you and knowing that there's a voice out there for Latinx community throughout the state of Michigan. So
thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And if you can stick around for just a couple minutes afterwards, that'd be great. So we will be taking the next 2 weeks off because it's election day, and I also wanted to take some time for things to settle down after election day so that we will not be back so we'll be taking the next 2 weeks off. But check our website, and also please, send links to your friends so that they can actually get into our YouTube channel or to our Facebook page to see all of our previous videos. And if you have a thought as to who might be an interesting guest, please feel free to forward that to us. Our website is ethnicdiversity.org, and you can always send an email to program@ethnicdiversity.org. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching or listening, and please, please, please vote. Thank you so much.